In this video, I will be comparing how people in West Africa and Central Africa perceived and interacted with the Portuguese, based on readings from Northrop and Tomowski, as well as class lectures. For centuries, European mapmakers like Gerardus Mercator produced maps that showed Africa as visually smaller and pushed to the margins of the world. In reality, Africa is the second largest continent on the earth, about 4 times the size of the United States, and bigger than the United States, China, India, and much of Europe combined. It has 55 countries, more than 1.4 billion people, and an enormous variety of climates, languages, and cultures. When we talk about West and Central Africa meeting the Portuguese, we're not talking about a backward, empty place suddenly discovered. We're talking about regions with long histories of complex societies, organized states, advanced technologies like iron working, sophisticated agriculture and cattle herding, and rich intellectual traditions preserved in oral literature, religion, and art. That context is crucial for understanding how Africans reacted to the Portuguese. They already had their own systems, identities, and ways of organizing power and trade. Another myth I want to challenge is the idea that Africans were once a homogeneous group. In reality, people in Africa identify themselves through a mix of language, occupation, location, religion, and social status. Scholars often group African languages into 5 major families: Afro-Asiatic, Nilo-Saharan, Niger-Congo, Khoisan, and Malayo-Polynesian on Madagascar, each with its own cultures, histories, and looks. Despite these differences, Northrop and Tomowski show important similarities across West and Central Africa. Number 1, Africa agency. In both regions, Africans are not passive. Kings, merchants, and ordinary people make strategic choices: who to trade with, what to sell, whether to accept missionaries, whether to ally with or resist these strangers. Number 2, trade at the center of the relationship. In both West and Central Africa, the relationship starts with trade. The Portuguese are looking for gold, spices, ivory, and eventually enslaved labor. Africans are looking for new goods, textiles, metalware, guns, beads, alcohol, tobacco that can increase status, security, or wealth. Number 3, new goods and new desires. Northrop makes the point that new goods can change people's minds and desires. You can compare it to something like the iPhone today, a powerful status symbol that can make people be willing to take big risks in order to achieve it. Christianity spreads more slowly and unevenly. In both regions, religion becomes a marker of identity and a political tool. We are Christian, they are not. We are Muslim, they are not. We are the people of this king, they are outsiders. Now the differences. Number 1, the depth of political involvement. In West Africa, the Portuguese mostly remained traders at the edges. In West Africa, many societies were part of large states like Ghana, Mali, Songhay, Kanem, Bornu, and the Hausa city-states, and others lived in smaller chiefdoms and village communities. They preserved history through oral traditions, proverbs, folktales, songs, drumming, and dances. Technologies included iron smelting, cotton weaving and indigo dyeing, canoe building, caravan trade with camels, and complex agricultural systems. In Central Africa, people also had iron technologies, agriculture, and cattle herding. Everyone was more or less self-sufficient, with abundant food, land, and there was less need for large-scale external trade before the Portuguese arrived. So when the Portuguese reached West and Central Africa in the late 1400s, they are plugged into already existing systems, not a blank state. According to Northrop, the Portuguese first reached the Senegal River region and then the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, in the late 1400s. They're looking for gold, spices, and enslaved labor. And they built fortified trading posts like Elmina, where long-distance trade was not central. There were no trans-Saharan caravans or Indian Ocean coastal cities. People mostly traded locally: food, iron, tools, crafts. That differences shapes everything. State-controlled trade instead of open trade. In Central Africa, king and elites controlled the trade with the Portuguese. Ordinary people cannot simply walk to the coast and swap goods with Europeans. Our lecture notes explains that one reason is the nature of the items that Portuguese brings: firearms, gunpowder, textiles, tobacco, alcohol, and later large-scale slave exports. Guns, especially, are politically dangerous. If every village can buy muskets, the king's power collapses, so the trade becomes monopolized by the state. In Central Africa, the Portuguese don't just trade, they become major players in politics. In 1491, Portuguese priests baptized Manicongo, Nzinga Nikui, and some of his officials. He becomes King João in Christian naming. His son, Nzinga Nemenda, later Afonso I, also converts, with Portuguese support, takes the throne in 1507. After that, Congo tries to become a fully Christian state with Catholicism woven into kingship law and diplomacy. Number 3, creation of a mixed middle group and reliance on the Portuguese. Over time, the relationship produces a group of Luso-African or mixed heritage intermediaries, sometimes called pomberos, who handle trade, especially in enslaved people. Portuguese men cohabit and have children with African women, and those descendants often act as brokers, interpreters, and slave dealers. Our lecture notes raise an important point early on. This close interracial intimacy suggests that modern racism had not yet fully formed as an idea. Africans and Europeans could still interact as moral equals in some spaces. But as firearms and slave exports expand, Central African states transform. Firearm creates insecurity in arms races. New centralized states like Congo, Ndongo, Luba, and Lunda grow in part to control the flow of guns and slaves. So in Central Africa, the Portuguese are not just occasionally traders. They become deeply embedded in state formation, religion, and the economy, turning older systems of food production and local trade into a slave-based, gun-driven political economy. Now, even with these differences, there are important similarities in how West and Central Africans perceived and interacted with the Portuguese. First similarity, attraction and curiosity about the goods and technologies. Both regions show evidence of people being fascinated by what the Portuguese bring. Guns that completely transform warfare, textiles, tobacco, alcohol, pipes, beads, and other fancy objects that stand out from local products. These goods excite desire, change status markers, and reshape local ideas of wealth and power. In both regions, people begin to think, how can we get more of these things? What do we have to give up in exchange? Tragically, the answer increasingly becomes human beings. Second similarity, Africans exercise agency and make strategic choices. Northrop emphasizes that Africa discovered Europe too. Africans are not just passive victims, they choose whom to ally with, whom to fight, and what to trade. They use Europeans to strengthen their own states, defeat rivals, or access new goods. They convert to Christianity or negotiate with missionaries on their own terms, sometimes blending with Christian ideas and local beliefs. Third similarity. Over time, both regions get pulled into the Atlantic slave system. In West Africa, pre-existing forms of servitude and pawnship become connected to a massive transatlantic slave trade. In Central Africa, Congo and neighboring states shift from economies based on food, copper, and ivory to a heavy focus on exporting enslaved people in exchange for guns and luxury goods. So in both regions, the Portuguese helped trigger a moral and social crisis. People start to treat human beings as major export commodities. Now let's highlight the differences between West and Central Africa and how they relate to the Portuguese. Difference number 1, the structure of trade. In West Africa, trade with the Portuguese fits into existing more open trade systems. There are many intermediaries, and while rulers are important, ordinary traders and communities still have some access. Trade is multi-directional. Saharan routes, internal markets, coastal exchange. Now, in Central Africa, trade becomes heavily centralized and state-controlled. Only kings and their officials can really deal with the Portuguese, especially when it comes to firearms. This shapes how ordinary people perceive the Portuguese. They are distant, powerful, and mediated by the king. In West Africa, Europeans play little direct political role before the 1800s. West African empires rise and fall largely due to internal dynamics and Saharan trade patterns. In Central Africa, as Harms on our notes say, the Portuguese become major political actors. They help decide who becomes king. Afonso I is a great example. They support the building of a Christian state in Congo, and they integrate Catholic rituals into court life and diplomacy. So while West African rulers used the Portuguese in Central Africa, the relationship sometimes looks more like a joint rule, or at least a heavy Portuguese influence at the top. Difference number 3, everyday contact and social mixing. In West Africa, there is interaction, but it's more spread across ports and trading. In the communities there are along those ports, the Europeans remain one group among many foreigners. In Central Africa, you get intense intimate connections. Portuguese men cohabit with African women. Their children become pomberos and other intermediaries. This leads to a distinct group with mixed identity, tied to both African and Portuguese worlds. This also affects perception of race. As mentioned in lecture, in the 1480s and early 1500s, the evidence of close sexual relationships suggests that modern racial ideology, black inferiority, and white superiority was not yet fully developed. The Portuguese and Central Africans could see each other as partners, potential kin, and allies, not automatically as racial others. Over time, however, the slave trade grows, especially in Americas. Europeans needed justification for turning Africans into commodities, and that's where racism evolves. Africans are labeled inferior, not truly Christian, not fully human. That shows how economic systems can create new ideologies and not just reflect them. What does comparing West and Central Africa experiences with the Portuguese tell us about African history and history of humanity? First, it shows that African societies were active agents, making difficult, sometimes tragic choices in the face of new opportunities and threats. They weren't discovered or brought into history. They were already historical actors with their own technologies, religions, and political systems. Second, it reveals how geography, technology, and political structure shape contact. West Africa's existing trade networks allowed for more diffuse, multi-layer interactions. Central Africa's long-distance trade and the extreme power of guns encouraged state-controlled, elite-driven relationships with the Portuguese. Third, it helps us understand how global systems like the Atlantic slave trade and racism emerge. At first, Africans and Portuguese could interact quite intimately and pragmatically, especially in Central Africa. But as slavery expands, especially in Brazil and the Americas, humans are converted into units of labor extraction, and ideologies like racism are invented to justify this. In other words, African history is central to human history. It shows us how global capitalism, race, religion, and state power evolved together. The story of West and Central Africa meeting the Portuguese is not a side note. It is part of the core story of how the modern world was made.